The year was 2003. The United States launched an invasion of Iraq. However, the strategic focus was not solely concentrated on the southern territories. Up in the north, there existed an entirely different and distinct type of power vacuum. It was a geographical void, but also a deeply significant political one as well. And eventually, this specific vacuum would force Washington to seek out a unique player unlike any other found in that entire region. This is the majestic Mount Kandil, which stands at an elevation of 3,500 meters. It is a single, solitary mountain that sits directly on the shared borders of three different countries, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. But the problem is not just its location, nor is it simply the fact that it sits on these borders. The real problem is that this mountain simply does not behave in the same way as all the other mountains do. For thousands of years, every single person who has attempted to seize control of it by force has met with failure. In order to understand the reasons why this happens, it is not sufficient to look at its height alone. We must also examine the forces that shape it. The answer is geography. There are three very distinct and compelling reasons why this region has remained unconquered. These narrow, treacherous mountain passes are far more than just mere terrain. They serve as a vital, ancient artery that connects Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau. And that fact alone signifies one singular, undeniable truth. Every single invading army, every major trade route, and every great empire in history was forced to pass through this corridor. And whoever controls these passes controls the movement between East and West. However, this is precisely where the true, insurmountable problem emerges. The mountain refuses to let the rules of the plains apply here. On the open plains, sheer numbers win the battle, but in this treacherous, jagged terrain, those same numbers become a burden, and the mountain slowly drains them away. Kandil does not just dominate the mountain passes, it also commands the flow of the water. The vital tributaries of the Tigris River originate from these high peaks, which means that whoever controls these heights does not just control the land, but they hold absolute sway over the very source of life for everyone living down below. And when you consider a volatile region like the Middle East, that is certainly no minor detail. However, even this observation is not nearly enough to fully explain the entire picture. There is, in fact, a third and far more dangerous factor at play here. Kandil is naturally and perfectly designed for a type of warfare that is unlike any conventional conflict. It is a war that does not require massive armies, but rather an intimate knowledge of the rugged terrain. And this is precisely where technology loses its total advantage. Now, this is certainly not a brand new story. In point of fact, it is quite an ancient one. Some 2,700 years ago, the mighty Assyrian Empire expanded all the way to the Zagros Mountains, right at the absolute zenith of its vast and formidable military power. Their vast armies dominated the open plains with ease, yet everything shifted the moment they reached the rugged mountain ranges. The heavy chariots that had once secured their victories became entirely useless, and the nature of the conflict changed. Victory was no longer a matter of raw strength, but a desperate struggle for survival. In the wake of this, the Medes stepped forward to fill the power vacuum left behind by those failing empires. The ancestors of the Kurdish people fortified themselves deep within these rugged mountains, then used those same heights as a strategic base to take down Nineveh, the grand capital of the mighty Assyrian Empire. This reveals a very important and recurring pattern.
For these people, the mountain was never just a place to hide, but a launchpad for conquest. Even the great Alexander himself was unable to simply ignore it. Alexander the Great, who remained virtually undefeated in every single open battle he ever fought, was forced to negotiate with the local mountain tribes just to secure his army's safe passage. This makes the entire picture much clearer. You do not conquer the mountain, you manage it. And over the long course of time, this fundamental logic has not really changed very much at all. With the Romans positioned on one side and the Parthians holding the other, neither empire truly managed to penetrate the heart of these mountains. This was not due to any formal political agreement, but simply because the terrain itself made such an endeavor impossible. The mountain range served as a natural border, without the need for anyone to ever sign a formal treaty. In later historical eras, the Kurdish Emirates were able to leverage this fact to their own advantage.
The Baban and Soran dynasties, along with others, established their strongholds among these rugged heights to alleviate the relentless pressure from the Ottoman and Safavid empires. It was not a matter of total control, but rather a vital, necessary space for their continued survival. And here, that same historical logic continues to repeat itself throughout the long passage of time. For whoever manages to control the mountain does not merely control the land, but the very possibility of resistance itself.
However, the real shift only begins in the 20th century. Mustafa Barzani, an icon of the Kurdish struggle, transformed these mountains into the center of gravity for the Kurdish movement. And because conventional armies rely on open roads,
The mountains were always there to disrupt that balance. Every single military advance would inevitably end in a long, desperate retreat back towards the safety of the rugged highlands, and it is only once they reached those high altitudes that the fundamental rules of the game would completely change. However, this delicate balance of power began to shift quite dramatically in the year 1975, when Saddam Hussein finally signed the Algiers Agreement with the Iranian leader, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The moment that this agreement was signed, all external support for the Kurdish revolution was abruptly cut off, and the results were immediate and devastating. Front lines collapsed, and there was a forced retreat back towards the mountains. Once again, the mountains returned to serve as a final, desperate resort for those with nowhere else to turn. Then came the devastating Iran-Iraq War, and these mountains were no longer just a simple refuge, but were transformed into a complex conflict zone, with opposing sides backing rival Kurdish factions in a long, bitter, and brutal struggle. The mountains were no longer merely standing outside the game, but had become fully and inextricably woven into the very heart of it. Then, in the year 1988, the brutal conflict finally reached its most devastating, most tragic, and most violent peak. The horrific Anfal campaign, the massacre at Halabja, the use of chemical weapons, and once again, countless desperate civilians were forced to flee to that same familiar sanctuary, the mountains. But on this particular occasion, it was not simply a military arena, but it was also serving as a vital humanitarian refuge for all those in desperate need. Following the conclusion of the Gulf War, a new power vacuum began to emerge within the north. And it was this power vacuum that later allowed for a truly unexpected development. In the 1980s, the PKK was searching for a stable base after leaving Lebanon and Syria under pressure. But instead of looking for a temporary refuge, they were looking for something far more substantial and deeply rooted. In Amak. A location from which they couldn't easily be removed, and Kandil was the answer. But the party's entry into the mountain wasn't an ordinary move, but rather the beginning of a complete transformation of the place. There were tunnels, hidden camps, and command centers, a fully functioning organizational structure buried deep inside the mountain. The mountain was no longer merely a refuge, but had instead become the very foundation of an undeclared state. And when their primary leader, Abdullah Öcalan, was finally taken into custody back in 1999, the entire organizational structure did not simply collapse, because the true center of gravity was never just one single person, but rather the location itself. Kandil eventually became the actual primary decision-making hub, and from that remote base, all of their core strategy and operations are carefully managed. Then, in the year 2011, a door suddenly swung open for an entirely unexpected expansion. The dedicated cadres who had trained in Kandil and were saturated with Öcalan's ideology moved across the border. They played a key role in forming the military and political structures of the People's Protection Units, YPG, and the various self-administration structures in northern Syria. Once again, Kandil didn't just send ideas. It dispatched people, complex organizational structures, and hard-won combat experience to a completely new battlefield. And in the year 2003, a strange new paradox began to emerge. When the United States military finally entered Iraq, they were immediately confronted with a difficult problem in the north. The militant group Ansar al-Islam, which maintained strong ties to Al-Qaeda, was deeply entrenched in the rugged mountainous areas near Halabja, close to the Kandil region. So, in light of this situation, what did the American forces decide to do? They indirectly relied upon the ongoing presence of the PKK within the region as a strategic means to tighten the noose around various Islamic groups. The mountain, whose primary organization Washington officially classified as a terrorist entity, simultaneously became a significant factor that contributed to its own military operations. It is a deeply contradictory equation that perfectly summarizes the very nature of Kandil, what we call the useful enemy. However, maintaining coexistence with Kandil did not come without a price for the Kurdistan region. In fact, it resulted in 3 heavy costs, and each one of them fundamentally altered the region's equation. The first of these costs is the creation of a standing justification for permanent foreign intervention. The presence of Kandil within the region has provided Turkey and Iran with a near-permanent justification for launching strikes within its borders. While Baghdad protests the violation of sovereignty, it is the region itself that ultimately pays the heavy price on its own soil. The second cost is a parallel administration operating within the state, and Sinjar serves as the clearest model of this. After PKK fighters successfully liberated the Sinjar region from the grip of ISIS in 2014, they did not fully withdraw from the area afterward. Instead, they proceeded to establish their own parallel administrative and military structures deep within the sovereign territory of the Kurdistan region. It was essentially a miniature functioning model of a state existing within another state. As for the third cost, it was purely political in nature, the ongoing conflict with the city of Erbil. The regional leadership based in Erbil and the PKK in Kandil represent 2 fundamentally distinct Kurdish political projects. The former seeks long-term stability, regional integration, and functions within the established state framework, while the latter operates almost entirely outside of that conventional structure. Furthermore, this ongoing conflict does not simply remain contained within our own borders. It significantly undermines the Kurdish standing on the global stage, and it serves to complicate any potential negotiations or diplomatic understandings that may arise. Over the course of these recent years, new paths for negotiation have finally begun to open up between the Turkish government and the PKK. While these are not the first attempts, they have appeared to be the most serious and substantial efforts since the Oslo talks, and it is precisely at this juncture that a highly sensitive and complex question has emerged. A question that is rarely posed in a direct manner. What would true success actually signify for the people of Kandil? Because if the ongoing peace process finally reaches its ultimate conclusion, if all armed operations were to cease permanently, and if a genuine comprehensive political solution were to emerge, then Kandil would inevitably lose the fundamental primary reason that granted it this entire significant role in the first place. The mountain, which once derived its strength from conflict, no longer holds the same significant role in these current times of peace, and this is precisely what makes certain regional parties, who are long accustomed to using the Kandil file as a strategic pressure card in their political calculations, less than entirely enthusiastic about closing this file for good. Because a strong and entrenched Kandil serves the interests of the ongoing conflict. However, a Kandil that exists in a post-conflict era could potentially redraw the delicate power balances of the entire region. Now, let us take a brief moment to consider and visualize this hypothetical scenario. The nation of Turkey decides to launch a military operation deep within the Kandil Mountains. At that very same hour, the city of Baghdad officially protests the blatant violation of its national sovereignty. Then, on the very next day, the nation of Iran decides to make a calculated move, and just 1 week later, something significant begins to shift deep within the territory of northern Syria. A single mountain, and suddenly 4 different capitals are set into motion because of it. For Turkey, Kandil is far more than just a mountain range located in a neighboring country. It is the single most critical security file currently sitting on the Turkish National Security Council's agenda. Ankara accuses the PKK of using the mountain as a base to launch attacks inside its territory. That's why it doesn't always wait for Baghdad's permission to respond. It has permanent military bases inside Iraqi territory and frequent operations under the principle of cross-border pursuit. أبدأ الملاحقة عبر الحدود. But there's another dimension that isn't always spoken of so frankly. Kandil is politically useful inside Turkey too. Every time tensions rise with Kandil, nationalist rhetoric rises with it inside Turkey, and specific parties and movements in parliament grow stronger. The mountain region here is not just a security file, but a complex political card involving both domestic and foreign interests, all at the same time. Within this equation, it is Iraq that seems to be the party feeling the most embarrassed. Kandil is administratively located within the Kurdistan region, but actual control over it isn't in the hands of the Peshmerga or Baghdad, but in the hands of those entrenched there. And the result? Turkey launches military strikes inside Iraq, and Iran is also conducting strikes inside Iraq. Meanwhile, Baghdad issues formal protests, but then simply waits because their options on the ground are limited. And when it comes to internal matters, Baghdad and Erbil cannot even seem to reach an agreement on who should bear the responsibility. The region says, we do not have control over the mountain. Baghdad says, but it is clearly located within your own sovereign territory. As for the mountain itself, it remains wild and answers to no one. Iran, for its part, is playing this entire file with both hands at the very same time. The Kandil region also includes the PJAK, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, which is actively opposed to Tehran. That is the reason why Iran occasionally strikes sites located deep within the mountain itself, as has happened repeatedly this year during its war with America and Israel. At other times, it exchanges intelligence with Ankara whenever their strategic interests happen to intersect. Yet, on the other hand, Iran does not seem particularly eager to close the Kandil file entirely. What is the reason for this? Because the mountain represents an indirect pressure card. And when it comes to the world of politics, a chronic, ongoing problem that you can actually leverage can sometimes prove to be far more valuable than a simple, quick-fix solution. Now, as for the situation in Syria, the equation there is quite a bit more complex, because the connection we have here isn't merely geographical in nature, but deeply ideological and human as well. The very same cadres who underwent rigorous training in the Kandil Mountains are the identical individuals who were instrumental in establishing the YPG and the SDF throughout northern Syria following the year 2011. Kandil did not merely export abstract ideas. It dispatched people, complex organizational structures, and a wealth of vital, deep combat experience. And this is precisely what Turkey has been asserting all along. The claim that the SDF is not a separate entity from Kandil, but rather a direct extension of it operating within Syria. Is this merely a case of political exaggeration, or is the underlying relationship between the mountain and northern Syria actually far deeper than what is being stated publicly? Regardless of the answer, the ultimate result remains roughly the same. Kandil has become an ideological and organizational reference for a conflict that stretches from the mountains of Kurdistan to the banks of the Euphrates. So, what is it that makes Kandil such a truly critical and influential player within this entire region? It's not just weapons, and it's not just ideology. It's the intersection of three factors that haven't changed in 2,000 years. Its location at the border of three countries, a terrain that defeats any invader, and the memory of a people who know this mountain has saved them more than once. What's new in our era is that the mountain is no longer just a refuge. It's become a decision-making center that influences the course of war and peace for more than one country at the same time. The most pressing question before us is this: can anyone truly close the Kandil file with military force? Or, as history suggests, is the only answer found in politics and compromise rather than missiles? Perhaps the answer lies in the lessons of history itself. في التاريخ نفسه. The Assyrians failed to break Kandil's spirit. Neither did the Romans or Ottomans. Countless empires marched here, clashing against this mountain, but whoever truly subdued it? None, not even today. خضعه فعلا. لا أحد حتى الآن. Share your thoughts in the comments. Is the solution in Kandil military or political?